You're listening to The Framework of Tomorrow, hosted by Keegan Goldfarb and brought to you by Rally Network, and our sponsor, Ashley Uank, who is a YouTuber conquering the nurse life, one YouTube video at a time. Please go check her out at Ashley Uank on YouTube. Thank you, and enjoy this episode of The Framework of Tomorrow. Hello and welcome to The Framework of Tomorrow. I am your host, Keegan Goldfarb, and I am super excited to get into episode 3 today. If you did not know, I am a part of a network of podcasters called Rally Network. At Rally Network, we are very focused on provoking thought in you and in others. So if you find any of the podcasts on Rally Network, if you enjoy them, go tell your friends, because I'm sure they will enjoy them too, and provoke thought in the general public of today. So today, our topic is Divided America. I'm going to be talking about kind of how America has been a divided country ever since the day it was founded. Yes, ever since the day it was founded. We have been divided. Obviously to different degrees, but I will share with you some of the major events on which we were divided about. So the first event, the very first event that pops up in American history, post-Revolutionary War, so it's after the war with the British. In our country, we had two groups called the Federalists and the AntiFederalists. This is in the late 1700s. So you might be asking, you're like, okay, what are these groups about? Who are the Federalists and who are the AntiFederalists? Well, the AntiFederalists, they believed that America should have a centralized government that still taxes the people. They tax the people in every single state, and they have power to make laws over each state and to govern over them. However, the Anti-Federalists believed in a small government, leaving most of the power to the states rather than a big government. So Anti-Federalists were like, we want small government. If I live in the state of Mississippi, I want Mississippi to tell me what to do and not a big government. I want so that if South Carolina over there wants to try to tell me to do something, they can't do that. I just want Mississippi to tell me what to do, so I'll move to Mississippi, and that's who's going to tell me what to do. However, there was a lot of back and forth in early American history with these two groups. And then came along a group of Federalists who decided to write something that you and I know today called the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States. However, in this time, it was actually illegal for them to do this. It was actually illegal for them to go and write this document, because if they wanted to put this document into effect and have a big government who govern over the people, they needed 2/3 of the states to agree on this document. So they wrote the Constitution. And they went back and forth for about a year about whether or not this should go into power. The Anti-Federalists disagree. The Federalists pushed for it. It went back and forth until the 9th state, we had New Hampshire, was the 9th and final state to agree to it. So that's 2/3. They all only needed 9. And so once they had everyone agree on it, then the Constitution went into effect, as we know today. So there was two groups of people who majorly disagreed, and that kind of just divided early America. But they ended up having a overall, 2/3 of agreement basically in the United States, and that's what happened. It was a majority rule, and the Constitution went into effect. So that was the first kind of divide we see in American history. The second divide, most notable divide, is probably the biggest divide America has ever seen, since this is the only divide where as we go to war with each other. Can you guess what this divide is? Yes, you guessed correctly. It's the Civil War. The Civil War, 1861. Like I said, probably the most divided our country has ever been, and hopefully will ever will be, because I don't want to go to war against my own country. It's kind of crazy. I doubt that would happen again, but anyway, I digress. So the divide, you're wondering, how did this divide start? I'm sure you know how this divide started. I would probably be concerned if you didn't know how this divide started, but I'll give you a little refresher. The North, aka the Union, they were like, slavery, it's not okay. It's not ethical. And they're like, everyone is equal, and it doesn't depend on what color their skin is. But the South, aka the Confederacy, the Confederates, they were like, well, then goes all of our slave labor. Whether or not some of them did genuinely believe, they're like, okay, African Americans are not equal to whites. They genuinely believe that. There might have been some people who were like, okay, I guess I agree with you, but they're kind of my labor, and then I have to pay people. So they disagreed with them. I'm not sure what people were thinking back then, but that's how it was. The North was like, we don't like this. The South is like, no, we need this, and we disagree with you. So the Confederates, they started the war by attacking some Union soldiers at Fort Summer in 1861. This war went on for 4 years. 4 years, that's a long time. But finally, the North won out the war in the year of 1865, and slowly after that, slavery was brought out of the South. Slaves were freed. They were able to get their own house and property and stuff like that. But there were some people who they had to force to do this, because they're like, I don't care if you won the war, I'm not giving up my slaves. So they like fought it off or whatever. But they forcibly took their slaves away, and they're like, they aren't your slaves. But sadly, just because this war was won and they freed the slaves, that didn't necessarily mean socially the slaves were automatically going to be equal. The African Americans. Sadly, that was not the case back then. So everyone was not equal, even though they just had a whole war about it. So about 100 years later, lots of stuff happened in between there. Very, very important things. But 100 years later, something called the Civil Rights Movement comes along. And they decide, they're like, okay, we're still not be treating the African Americans, and even some white people were like, African Americans still aren't being treated equal. They had segregation. You could probably in 1950s easily go to the South and find a white person in an African American bathroom, which is horrible. It's horrible, but that's how it was. They still were being treated differently socially, even though they weren't slaves. They were still being treated differently. In fact, we still deal with problems like this today. However, because of people like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and many, many, many other people, we now today have equal social rights for everyone. Like I said, sadly, we still deal with cases about this, but because of the civil rights movement, where people were disagreeing still on whether or not African Americans or people of color still held the same equality. The civil rights movement happened, and that would really, really, really pushed for people to think about it. But it still exists today, but not on a scale as it did back then. So America may be divided. And even today, we are still incredibly, incredibly, incredibly divided by our ideas, and politics and stuff like that, to the point where people won't even talk to their neighbor if they're they're like, oh, you're a Republican or you're a Democrat. I'm not talking to you because I'm the other one. Not everyone's like that, but some people are like that, and it's pretty horrible. But even though we're divided, I also wanted to talk about some of the times in American history, even though we're divided, that we came together and we fought off whatever problem came our way. So one of the first things that came to mind was the World Wars, both World War I and World War II. So this was before the Civil Rights Movement. Like I said, a very important thing that happened between both the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. We had every single American come together, whether or not they were going off into war, or the strong people, both men and women, that stayed behind and kind of took care of America back at home. So that was one time when we came together despite our differences, especially then because the Civil Rights Movement hadn't even happened yet. And we helped each other then. The Great Depression, there's people helping each other back then. And even at 9/11, so this is more recent now, 9/11, even though some of those people I'm sure disagreed, like on a political level or something like that, they still came together and were helping each other then. And I think, honestly, that is one of the beauties of living in America, is that we can disagree with each other, but at the end of the day, I think we can still agree with each other. Like, for instance, I worked at a grocery store a couple years ago, and my boss could not be on the whole other spectrum of some of the things that I believe are like correct or whatever in politics. But I'm not even kidding you, he was my favorite manager. We got along so well, even though we disagreed, and we both like very much publicly disagree, like not publicly disagreed, publicly like stated that we're like, yo, I don't actually agree with you on that. We still were able to get together and get work done. And I think that's one of the beauties of America, is that we aren't silenced in our opinions, but we can still come together and get work done, get jobs done, and help people out, whether or not you agree with them or not. So that's kind of all I had for you today. This is going to be a little shorter episode, but I did want to cover this and talk about how, even though America's is divided, I think we've been divided, like I said, all the way since the founders. I think that is one of the beauties of being in America, is that we may be divided, but we still come together in times of need. And I think it's important to talk about this now, because we're seeing another extreme today in kind of our dividedness with politics. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind, that just because you may disagree with somebody politically, doesn't mean you can't be their friend or help them out or have a conversation. You know, I think we can be respectful, and I think we cannot go to the extremes of another civil war. But yes, so that's kind of the beauties of America, that we can disagree. We can agree to disagree, basically. So always at the end of my episodes, I have a random history fact of the day. So the random history of the fact today is the Orang Medan. I'm pretty sure I'm saying that wrong. Orang Medan. I'm just going to say that. That's what it's called. So this was a ship, the Orang Medan, in 1940s. In the 1940s, Orang Medan, the SS Orang Medan was a Dutch vessel. And so there were some nearby ships going along, and they suddenly got a transmission through Morse code, and it was a distress call that said all officers and crew on the ship, including the captain, are dead. So everyone's like, what's going on here? And then after that message, it came a bunch of random Morse code that no one understood and no one could decipher. They're like, what's going on here? And then finally, it ended with "I die" in Morse code. That's how it ended. And everyone's like, what in the world? So they went looking out for the ship. And once they found the ship, they boarded the ship and they looked around the ship, and there was all of these, the whole crew, and including a dog. But they were all not face down. They were on their back, looking straight up towards the sky. And they had their arms reaching out like they were frozen in a position that they were like fighting something off or like trying to reach for something. And it was just this super eerie sight, and it was just horrifying. One of the reports that I read after this that they were saying. But shortly after, when they tried to take the ship back to shore, they tried to pull it back. Before they could even hook it on, the ship's bowels burst into flames, and everyone that went to find the ship luckily got off of the ship before it completely sunk. But it completely sunk, and nobody knows what happened to this day. Nobody knows. So it's kind of creepy. I think that's horrifying. I heard this story the other day, and I was like, oh my gosh, I got to talk about this on the podcast. I think the part where they're like looking up at the sky and they're just frozen like that is horrifying. And it makes me wonder, like, if this was actually real. I know apparently this is actually a denied story, like by the governments at the time. They're like, no, this didn't actually happen. But people were saying it did. So, I mean, I guess that leaves it up to what you think. Do you think this was a real story? If so, what does that mean? That's kind of creepy. But yeah, thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Framework of Tomorrow. I really, really hope you enjoyed this episode. And I'm Keegan Goldfarb, and I will see you next time.